Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Tim Kachuriak is the founder and chief innovation and optimization officer for NextAfter, a fundraising research lab consultancy and training institute that offers charities, nonprofits, and NGOs to help them grow their resource capacity. A nonprofit thought leader, Tim is the author of the book Optimize Your Fundraising, lead researcher and co-author of the Online Fundraising Scorecard, Why Should I Give to You? The Nonprofit Value Proposition Index Study, and the Midlevel Donor Crisis. Tim has trained organizations in fundraising optimization around the world and is a frequent speaker at international nonprofit conferences. He's also the co-founder and board member for the Human Coalition, a member of the board of directors for Open Doors USA, an advisory board member for the SMU Digital Accelerator, and an advisory board member for the Blackbaud Institute for Philanthropic Impact. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nick, thanks for having me.
So we were chatting offline before we hit the record, and I see you as the perfect guest because you don't necessarily brand yourself as a behavioral scientist per se. You're not necessarily saying, in your branding, you're not doing behavioral insights, which is a lot of the people I have on the show, and that's can be a good thing and a bad thing, and we'll maybe get to that. But I do see the work that you're doing at NextAfter and how you sort of approach what you do as very behavioral based, or let's say psychological based. So when I came across you on LinkedIn, I believe, or some social network, and then I was diving into NextAfter, I was immediately caught by that attitude, and what caught me in particular was the opening mandate, which I see everywhere on the website, is the question, why do people give? And the tagline is that you guys have is, we're obsessed with answering that question. So I find that so simple, and yet of course that's probably one of the most complex questions we humans have ever asked. So let's get right into it. Let's dive into the philosophical questions, and can you answer that question for us and for listeners? Why do people give or not give?
Well, if you think about it, Nick, giving is very much an irrational decision. I mean, you think about it, I'm going to go give my money, and the ultimate benefit is going to rest with some other beneficiary. So on paper, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it from a commercial application standpoint. And yet, what we find through our research is that donors really do receive something. It doesn't come in the form as a tangible benefit, but in many cases, it's an intangible benefit. It's something they feel, something they experience. They've been blessed. They've been inspired with a vision of how they can make a difference in the world or in someone else's life. And so by giving, they're able to experience that benefit. And we find it to be completely fascinating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess that's right. That's right in line and in the spirit of modern or contemporary behavioral economics, which say in the 2000s, when this field and this whole movement started to grow. There were these practitioners and academics challenging the neoclassical economic theories, which were saying that we were all rational actors, and according to those theories, we shouldn't actually be giving to, especially to non-kin members, with whom we share, genetic overlap. So this whole quote unquote irrationality piece is very much consistent with the messaging that comes out of the world of behavioral economics. Has that always been in your world of fundraising and the psychology of donor and donating? Has that been around, or is that also a new sort of way of thinking?
Well, what really kind of led me on this quest was really just trying to figure out how to help my nonprofit organizations raise more money, right? So from a very practical standpoint, if a nonprofit organization does not have oxygen, they do not have revenue, they cannot continue on with their work. And so, that kind of utility of just trying to raise more money kind of turned into this more introspective question as to what is it that really motivates people to do these things. And in our work, we spend a lot of time doing digital fundraising. And if you think about it, like the web is perhaps one of the greatest behavioral laboratories that's ever been constructed, because instead of asking people their opinions or setting up clinical trials, what I can do is create two different versions of a message, two different versions of a transaction experience, and actually monitor how people respond to those things in real time. So it's just been really fascinating to really leverage the web as not just a channel of communication, but as a laboratory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do you, like, if you could walk us through, say, a typical, if there is anything typical about the work you guys do, like a typical A/B test or an online experiment, an experimental test. Do you have a hunch? Do you have like an idea of like, oh, maybe this will work more than that? Where do those hunches, or where do those intuitions arise from? Where do they come from? Is it just learnings that you've gathered over the years? Yeah, what's the sort of process of running those A/B tests?
Well, there's a number of different factors that influence somebody making a decision online. And basically, we've deconstructed that, and there's several variables that take place. The first main variable that will determine whether or not somebody gives a gift is their ingoing motivation. What are they coming to the organization for in the first place? If they're coming in casually or because they read a story in somebody's Facebook post, they may be just kind of casually interested, so the motivation's not as high. Whereas if they just received an urgent letter in the mail for some sort of disaster that's happened and people are needing help right now in the moment, they may be coming with an ingoing motivation to want to respond by offering help in the form of financial support. So motivation is the primary factor. The second thing is, how does the organization convey the value proposition to the user? How do they communicate the reasons ultimately why they should give a gift to this organization rather than some other organization, or not at all?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that really the charity has a lot of control over. And that's where we spend a lot of time, is really trying to figure out how to best craft that message. And then there's other factors that are in play. So there's things like friction in the giving process. Do I have to go through 8, 9, 10, 12 steps to complete a transaction, or is it as simple as 2 clicks? So that's the friction component. And then there's anxiety. Obviously, like when somebody is making this irrational decision to give a gift to support this work, they want to make sure that their dollars are going to go exactly to what they believe they're going to. They want to make sure that their transaction is secure, that this is really a legit charity, that they're going to not spend their money frivolously. So there's a number of these different kind of psychological factors that we have to overcome. And what's interesting is when you start to then break those down and say, well, how do I, for example, like reduce the anxiety of making a transaction online? One simple thing we found is just by shading the little payment box on a donation form and putting a little padlock in the corner can unlock up to 15% increase in conversion. And it's just subtle things like that that sometimes make the difference. But where we found the biggest gains is where we really are playing with the messaging itself, right? Where we're really kind of teasing out those motivational factors as to why somebody should respond right now in this moment to this urgent opportunity to give.
That's fascinating. In your research and work, have you found there's different segments of givers or consumers, like different sources of that motivation and the will to give? Like if will something be optimized for me but not for you, and vice versa, or is it generally sort of a broad application of what works?
Yeah, no, that's a great insight, Nick. I mean, it does vary donor to donor, but even more so, it varies organization to organization. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm like an advocacy type of organization, and I'm trying to motivate and stimulate my donor base to want to respond to give, sometimes we induce anger, right, or outrage. Like, can you believe that this thing is happening? Sign your name, attach your name to this
Mm-hmm.
petition or to this open letter, and voice your support. And once you kind of move somebody in that direction, then when you present them with an offer to give to further support that work, to make sure that piece of legislation moves through, they're much more apt to give. Other people, other organizations like membership-based associations, for example, their value proposition more is about this sense of belonging, right? Where they are, you're giving to join this like-minded community that believes and supports the types of ideas or the types of research or the types of work in the area of cause-based world that you believe in, and so you're giving to kind of like be part of something. Other times, it's more of like a guilt type of motivation, where somebody, they feeling indebted because they have so much when compared to another community that has so little. And so they're often motivated by this sense of guilt and wanting to give back because they feel, number one, grateful for what they have, but compassionate for those who don't have. So it's a number of different type of factors, and that is the biggest challenge, is just trying to sort the various different people that are flooding into these organizations through their digital communications, and move them along a pathway that's aligned to their specific motivation.
So cool. So I did a lot of work in the psychology of emotions, and everything you're hearing, I'm like, oh, this makes sense. This makes sense, even though I haven't necessarily applied it to this world. So I'm curious. I'm going to sort of like give you my pet theories, and then you can tell me if I'm totally off my rocker or at least somewhat close. So in emotion science or affective science, there's this distinction between approach and avoidance type emotions. And then there's the more obvious distinction of like positive versus negative emotions. So, positive emotions like joy, happiness, pride, and then like also the ones you mentioned with sort of community things like solidarity and togetherness. What we do know when you think of those two dimensions of positive versus negative and approach versus avoid is negative emotions, and in particular the ones that are along the avoidance dimension. Those are things like guilt, as you mentioned, shame, sadness, even empathy, which is an interesting one. We know that actually leads people towards avoidance or inaction. Um, Versus on the other side, you have your more approach based emotions, which are often positive, but the most often what we see, the most impactful approach emotion is actually anger or outrage. So when somebody's outraged and they're feeling angry at something, they want to do, like, they're literally drawn to move and to behave and to act in order to resolve that anger or that outrage. So when you say these things like, there's some organizations who are appealing to donors through more of this anger versus outrage, versus those who are doing, say, like guilt or shame or trying to evoke a sense of sadness. Is there differing outcomes in the success of the amount of fundraising they're able to succeed?
Yeah, absolutely. We find very significant evidence that supports that whole theory, that when you evoke this emotion of anger, it's very motivating to get somebody to want to do something about that. And this really plays out a lot in political type organizations. This is kind of like the classic way that a lot of those types of organizations do fundraising. They will, pull up a news clip or a bite about, something the opposition has to say, which they know is going to be, sparking some type of visceral response, and it kind of gets people all frothed up and all like aggravated about it. And so then when they present the opportunity to give, they tend to see much higher conversion rates with that approach. The challenge with that, though, is that it's kind of like, at least based on the data that we've been tracking, it's a short-lived type of relationship with the organization. So you have to continue to feed those little anger triggers if you want to get people to continue to give. And it's much more of a transactional relationship versus somebody that is motivated by something deeper than just that visceral response. So although we can get very high conversion rates initially, like if we're trying to acquire new donors, that's a very strong technique to get lots of people to say yes right away. Getting them to continue to say yes becomes much more of a challenge.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to sustain somebody on just continually pissing them off over
Right.
and over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Um, I remember this reminds me of a study I came across. I'll try and dig it up and put it in the show notes for listeners. It was basically like a network analysis, and it was asking the question which emotions are um, people when they feel those emotions coming across certain messages or content online, like what are they going to share? Like, is it the things that make them happy, or is that going to motivate them to share? Is it the things that make them sad? Is that going to motivate them to share? And I remember there was like the top three emotion states, and the first was anger or outrage, so that's consistent with what we're saying here. The second was humor, obviously memes and stuff like that, they just sort of
Hmm.
take off. But the third one, which was interesting, and maybe you have some insight to elaborate on here, was awe, or this idea of
Mm.
self transcendence. When people feel a sense of awe in coming across something, they feel so much more compelled to share and to share with others. Have you found anything along those lines?
Well, I've got some anecdotal data from just some of my LinkedIn posting.
Mm,
There's a video that I came across, which probably answers the reason why do people give better than anything else I've ever seen, and it's actually a TV advertisement for a Thailand-based um, insurance company of all things.
mm,
And it just you go through this montage, and this guy, he just he kind of goes around and just helps people. He does all these like little type of things, and people look at him and give him kind of like cross-eyed looks, like, why are you doing this, man? And at the end, they kind of explain, here's why he does it, because like he's becoming he's coming out of himself, and he's going into other people, and because of that he's able to experience love and warmth and value and higher purpose. And
mm,
every time I share that video, it gets more like reshares and positive comments and likes and all that stuff than anything else that I share.
mm,
So I think that there is something really to that, that when you like tap into something that is transcendent in some way, that makes people experience this awe, it's something that's very attractive, and it's something that other people kind of resonate with on a very visceral level as well.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when just as a non-behavioral scientist, just as an
Hmm.
average lay consumer and user, I'll still often come across, inadvertently, if it's online ads or radio commercials or TV commercials, for those of us who still have cable. Um, there's a lot of those organizations and agencies who are still appealing to sadness. Like, I can't remember there's like the popular ones. It seems like a
Hmm.
lot of them are still like showing kids in Africa who are starving. I wonder, like, they might have worked with folks like you, or organizations like yours, NextAfter, like, or do you think they have some insight that this might not be working as well as they think it is, in terms of evoking those emotions and optimizing and getting those conversions?
Well, I do know that there's a movement to kind of move away from what some label poverty porn, which is those kind of
Mm,
like sad images and sad
hmm,
puppies and sad little children, and moving to more positive type of messaging. Um, I think the challenge is that the sad stuff works so well, and so from a very practical standpoint, it's been hard to move people. Now there is some research going on. There's a group based in the UK, the Center for Sustainable Philanthropy, and they are really doing some pioneering work in the area of philanthropic psychology. And what they say is that communication should be designed not just to generate positive results, but to also provide a positive benefit to the donor. And so if you're continuing to like put out things that feed the guilt, um, you know feed that kind of like that guilt instinct or the anger
mm-hmm,
instinct, it's ultimately not doing well
hmm,
for the donor, right? And so they're saying that there is a way to actually optimize communications so that it does achieve the results that you need, but also actually leaves the donor feeling being a better person, receiving a positive benefit. So
hmm,
that's some stuff that's really new work that we're really tapping into. to say, how can we, yes, optimize for better performance, but at the same time, optimize for, a better donor.
So all of what we're talking about reminds me of this one organization called Charity Water, which I'm sure you are familiar with. And I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about the work that they do, and one of the things that I came across, which I'm assuming is a really effective strategy, is demonstrating to the average user and to the donor that their giving has an immediate impact. So if you go to Charity Water, and I'll link to it in the show notes, you can actually go to this map which shows where all their work is in installing these different wells and water systems throughout the world, in mostly in developing nations. And so you can, using GPS, you can zoom in on these small towns and remote villages, click on the exact location, and up comes this picture of the well itself being constructed, being built, and then a story of the people who are benefiting from it being in their town. So they only have to walk 5 minutes to get fresh water as opposed to 5 hours. So this idea of proving to the donor that their giving has this impact, is that something you guys have shown as well or found?
Yeah, and actually, everything you just talked about really articulates everything we think about as it relates to that value proposition question. So remember,
Mm,
I said the value proposition question must answer why, if I'm your ideal donor, should I give to you rather than some other organization or not at all? And just
mm,
in the 2 minutes that you explained how you can go to their website, you can click on a coordinates, you can zoom in, you can see the well, and you can see how the impact of your gift planting this well enables people to not have to walk 5 hours, but 5 minutes to go get fresh, clean water. And oh, by the way, the connection is so much tighter between you and the ultimate beneficiary of your gift. And so,
mm,
all those reasons really paint a very powerful argument for why you should give to that organization versus another one. And honestly, it's the reason why Charity Water has been so successful when it relates to fundraising, is that they
mm,
really do a great job of creating that connection. They don't take the organization completely out of the picture, but they move them out of the way so that there can be tighter connection between the beneficiary and the donor.
mm, mm, mm. Very cool. Um, so just a bit of a pivot. We're already touching on all these themes and these ideas of how you do the work that you do, and it has this very distinct behavioral economics or applied behavioral science approach, even though you're not necessarily like calling it out as such. um but where in your past did you get turned on to some of these ideas of online experimental testing and A/B testing and using behavioral insights for optimization? Did you stumble across it? Did you read a book? Was it a past sort of career that you had? Just curious to hear the story.
Yeah, about 12 years ago, I attended a conference put on by a group called Mech Labs, which at the time was the largest conversion rate optimization company in the world. They would work with
Mm,
large Fortune 100 companies, and they would help these companies optimize their online sales funnel. And when I first encountered that, and I started to see how they were really leveraging the web as a laboratory and not just a channel, I was like, wow, why aren't we doing this in the nonprofit space? I was working at a direct response agency and working with lots of different types of organizations. And I said, I wonder if this same type of approach of actually using rigorous scientific, experimentation to try to move people to say yes could work for a donation just like it works for a product sales or a B2B lead.
mm,
So started just honestly not knowing really what I was doing, but just started experimenting and finding that not only does it work, but it works maybe even better in our space. And perhaps that's because
mhm,
the barriers to entry to digital marketing are very, very low, which means anybody can hop online and start sending emails or posting things on Facebook. And I think that that's led to the proliferation of a lot of really bad marketing is because it
mhm,
doesn't have a lot of barriers to entry. And so if you overlay that inside of the nonprofit industry, which has fewer resources and is not able to be as competitive as the for-profit space, there's a lot of bad marketing that exists. And so
mm,
it didn't take much to get some pretty considerable gains. And I just fell in love with it. I was like, man, as a consultant, I know that I don't know the answers to everybody's problems. Everybody looks at me like I do, but I know deep down inside I don't know the answers. But finally, I discovered a way where I could go and find the answers because I'm not a fundraising expert, and no, neither is anybody else. The only true experts are the donors themselves.
Hmm.
And so, if we can kind of humble ourselves and really become students of the donors, they'll teach us everything we need to know about how to get them to give.
Hmm. Hmm. And in one of your, I think it's one of the ebooks or the PDF resources you guys have available, which are fantastic, by the way, and I will definitely link out to listeners, and I highly recommend you download um, any one of them. There's one that I have, and this is a quote, so I'll just read it out.
Mhm.
Um, in order for our message to be effective, in order for it to move our donors up the mountain towards the macro yes, it must consistently convey a stronger perceived value than the perceived cost at every single decision point.
Mhm.
This is why the value proposition is so critical to fundraising success. So I find it's so cool. I love that. It has this this very distinct economic sort of valuation flavor to it. This analysis, it's very behaviorally informed. And shortly after that quote, I think you guys say like you need um, organizations need to keep their for every small decision along the way, they need to keep the cost light and the value heavy rather than the cost heavy and the value light. Um, did you guys come across that just in all of your online testing and experimentation? Can you elaborate a little bit on this sort of macro yes and the small decisions up to that point?
Well, sure. I mean, the problem is like being inside an organization, you get tunnel vision, right? You become very myopic. You become 100% focused on your ultimate outcome. So, if I'm a fundraiser working in a nonprofit organization, I'm fixated on trying to increase my donations. What I don't realize is that in order for somebody to give a donation, they have to go through a series of different decisions, right? So, like for example, if I post something on Facebook, they have to be scrolling through their news feed. Something has to arrest their attention where they say,
Mm,
huh, they have to read it, they have to click on it. Then they get to a landing page, and there's a series of micro decisions the donor makes as they navigate the content, the copy, the images, the video, whatever happens to be on that page. And every step of that journey, that potential donor is consistently weighing the perceived value of moving forward versus the perceived cost. And if you're not
mm,
continuing to deliver more value than cost, they'll bail out of the process and abandon ship. So really, it's become the foundation for how we think about optimizing uh, marketing performance online. We try to look through the experience and try to understand where are all these little micro decisions taking place. And data informs where people are falling off the mountain, right? Where somebody's bailing out of the process. And so we
mm,
use data to identify where are those gaps. And then we say, okay, what is it about this step of the process that is causing people to see more value than cost? And how can we optimize it? And that's where we run our experiments, is at those specific decision junctions.
mm-hmm. Very cool. And if you can say, are there sort of the top contenders of where those drop offs happen? Is it a friction point? Is it confusion? Is it the like sort of going back to your earlier point? Is it anxiety? Can you point to one or two of the main ones where people fall off that mountain?
Sure. So let's take a one conversion path where I'm going from a Facebook ad all the way through to a donation experience.
Mm,
So one fail point is the text that somebody puts on the Facebook ad, right? So like you can use a little text, you can use a lot of text. I mean, it's pretty open ended. And what we
mm,
find is sometimes we don't give people enough information to pique their interest to want to even go to the next step of the process. Then let's talk about the little call to action button on the Facebook ad. If your call to action button says give now, well, basically you're making someone have to make a quantum leap decision. I've been
mm,
scrolling through my news feed. You get something that catches my attention, and immediately you're jumping to the ultimate call to action, which is to give or to not to give. And so we found by lessening that commitment to something like learn more can increase the number of people that click to the next step of the process, which is the landing page. On the landing page, the very first thing that they see is the headline. Most headlines are very instructive. give
Mm.
now, donate, right? They don't continue to arrest attention and get people to want to read the first 2 inches of copy. And if they
Mm.
get into the first 2 inches of copy, that's where the value proposition has to be exposed. And then when somebody goes down into the actual transaction process itself, one of the places where people are consistently pausing is right around the payment area.
Mm.
And as I mentioned, there's things that we've done, just very subtle things that really overcome some of the anxiety associated with giving out, sensitive information like payment information online. So there's multiple different kind of fail points along the way, and it's just identifying those and figuring out how do I like reduce the amount of commitment at each stage so it's appropriate with what I'm asking them to do.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like it's a gentle easing in by sounds like what you're saying, as opposed to just right off the bat hitting them over the head, donate now, give your money now. It seems like that's just too much of a commitment right off the bat. It sounds like that, that the user and the consumer needs to learn a bit about that, like you said, that value proposition, maybe read a bit more copy, and learn about what the story is, what the organization, what the institution is doing, sort of, yeah, just gently sort of leading them to that final decision point. And that's the macro yes, is that what you guys call it?
The macro, yes, right. That's
The
correct. And
macro
in many
yes.
cases, in that first experience, we don't even ask people to give money. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
macro findings from our research is that people do not go online to give; they go online to get. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we find is much more effective is taking something and creating a piece of content that has high perceived value to the audience, like an ebook or a self assessment or an online course, where we're actually delivering value first to that person. We're not asking them for money at all. We're giving them value first. We're getting their name and their contact information. And then we can use that to continue to build that relationship over time so that they have a better understanding as to who the organization is, what they do, and how they fit into that with their financial contribution. So
Mm.
that's kind of like the pathway, if you will.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes doesn't lead with asking people to give. I mean, think about it.
And
If
that
you met somebody for the first time, like if you go and uh, I don't know if you're married, but like if you're a single guy, you go into a bar and you meet a girl and you're just like, hey, let's come home with me. I mean, that's probably not the best approach, right? Usually what happens is you meet for the first time, you exchange contact information, there's a little bit of back and forth, there's a little bit of banter,
yeah.
getting to know each other, you maybe go on a date or two, and then maybe then you go for the jugular, right? But like
Yeah.
you can't, it's the same is true when it comes to any type of transaction. You can't just jump right to it or else you're going to scare people off.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which to me, again, as this sort of this layperson in the space, it seems it runs counter to a lot of the strategies and approaches that organizations use, which is just right out of the gates, give, donate, appeal to these emotions, etc., etc. Um, is so what you're saying is makes, now that I think about it, makes total sense. Is this, like, if you had to look at all of the organizations out there, are most coming around to this idea that it's sort of you got to ease them in, you got to get them on a mailing list, you got to share that valuable content, you got to sort of court them as a consumer and as a donor. It is are organizations thinking this way, or is this sort of
There,
cutting edge?
sadly, it's still a bit on the edge for many organizations, and you have to understand why. So, like most nonprofit organizations, they raise money, or they have traditionally raised money primarily through direct mail, which doesn't give
Mm,
you the same ability as digital media to be able to cost effectively acquire a lead and then continue to send value to that person over time so that when you do ask, they're much more, inclined to make a gift. So that transition is starting to take place, but for many organizations, it's revolutionary to say, yeah, don't ask for money right away. They're like, what? Like, yes, trust me,
mhm.
deliver value first.
Yeah, which is almost like, digital 101 kind of, right? Like
Hmm.
in your for-profit digital marketing, that is like, yeah, that is, give a free product and get them on a mailing list and get them into a drip campaign, like sort of just your typical funnel. So yeah, it makes total sense that this same thinking should be applied in the not-for-profit and the fundraising space, because surprise, surprise, those people giving are people, and they behave in the same way, and they think the same emotions as people who are, purchasing in the for-profit space. So it's not surprising to hear that. You have this one thing called the Mystery Donors Study, which was really
Mhm.
cool. And I'm not going to attempt to explain it. I'll punt it over to you to walk listeners through what you guys did, how you sort of defined what you were tracking and measuring, and what you actually found in the end.
Sure. So, um, one of the most important skills of any marketer is really empathy, developing empathy. So we try to work on developing empathy inside of our organization. And we do this by becoming donors. We say, look, if we really want to understand what it feels like to be a donor, we should go do that many, many times. So what we'll do is we'll go subscribe to hundreds of organizations at the same time. We'll monitor everything they send us, every email, every text message, every voicemail, every direct mail piece they send us. We analyze those pieces of correspondence and we wait for the organizations to ask us to make a financial gift. And when they do, we respond by giving a donation of $20, upwards of $5,000, depending on what we're studying. And then we monitor how these charities change the way they communicate with us once we've crossed the Rubicon from being casual visitor to subscriber to
Hmm.
donor. And it's absolutely fascinating. And what's most interesting to me is I can have two organizations that are very similar, similar size, similar revenue footprint. They do similar type of work, and they have two completely different communication practices. And honestly, this is where we get a lot of our test ideas. We say, look, if organization A is doing one thing, organization B is doing something else, how do we know what works best? So we take some of those ideas, we bring it back to our lab, and we've got a number of different nonprofit research partners, and we'll test, version A versus version B, and we'll monitor how donors actually respond. And it sometimes illuminates some great breakthroughs.
Hmm. Hmm. Very cool. And in the age that we are living in right now of COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
um, how has your thinking and your work changed, if it has at all? What is the psychology of donating and giving? Is it different now for the average person? And my thinking of it is like, on the one hand, there's increased financial burden. There's a level of risk and tolerance that I'd imagine would lead to fewer donations overall on average. But then on the other hand, I've noticed this, like, there's a very like palpable collective generosity of the human spirit, which is
Mm-hmm.
fantastic to see. And you see it in different geographies and different markets. All these people are sort of coming together, which of course would lead to a sort of increase in giving and pro sociality. So, which one have you guys seen? And what are your thoughts on the whole thing?
Yeah, actually, I have data to answer this question. So
Perfect, even better.
yeah, we're tracking email communications for 165 different organizations across 12 different nonprofit industry verticals. So that could
Wow,
be like
wow.
arts and culture, international, disaster relief, uh, you know, public policy. So a whole range of different types of organizations. We've been tracking communications for a full year. So we started to look at data from January 1st of this year all the way through present day. And what we're finding is, since the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen a significant increase in the number of messages that nonprofit organizations are sending to their donors.
Hmm,
We're seeing a significant percentage of those communications, whether that's a solicitation or just a newsletter or an update, are mentioning COVID-19 or coronavirus in some way in their communications. So
hmm,
last week, 73% of all communications being sent by these nonprofit organizations was mentioning COVID-19,
hmm.
coronavirus, or pandemic in their communications.
Wow.
So then flip over on the donation side, like how are donors responding? Uh, what we find is actually year over year, at least for digital revenue is up 13%. We're finding that donors are giving more gifts this year compared to last year, but they're giving smaller gift amounts. So the average gift is
Hmm,
a little bit smaller. But there's so many more people giving. There overall there's an increase in revenue for about 13%. So it
hmm,
is always fascinating to me just the power and the mystery of generosity and just how people really do respond, even though they may be experiencing a bit of uncertainty themselves about their financial future. That kind of solidarity of we're all in this together really seems to play out during times like this.
hmm, hmm. Well, I'm glad. That's the one answer as opposed to the other. But I'm sure you guys will be keeping a close eye on that as this whole thing unfolds. One more question for you, if you don't
Hmm.
mind, Tim.
Sure.
So this is the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. Of all the problems, which we just talked about one, that are happening right now in the world, where do you see behavioral insights or psychology of giving? Where do you see that being applied to help the most?
Well, in my obsession of trying to understand like, why do people give, most recently I've come to the conclusion that that's not a deep enough question. It doesn't get to a level of depth sufficient enough to really have wider implications. And so what we're kind of thinking through and wrestling with now is like, look, you can't get somebody to give unless you first get somebody to care.
Hmm.
And if you think about that, like getting people to care matters across every single industry, right? I mean, can you imagine what my business would be like if I could really just get my employees to care? Could you imagine what my marriage would be like if my
Hmm.
spouse really cared? Can you imagine like what my family would be like if my kids really, really, really cared?
Hmm.
And so what we're trying to do is at least put that lens over the top of the research that we're doing and some of the testing work we're doing and saying, look, is there something deeper that we can understand about human behavior and human nature that may transcend our riddle of trying to get people to give financial gifts to nonprofit organizations, and maybe be able to extrapolate some, some finding, some truth as it relates to, this whole idea of how do we build care alignment?
Hmm. Very cool. Very cool. So it sounds like you have another question to ask that you're asking, and I think just thinking this through as I'm talking to you over the last hour, it just lays bare a lot of human nature and human psychology in a way that you can glean and uncover these remarkable insights about how humans act and how humans feel and how we behave in a way that you can't necessarily in the for-profit sector. um, and so it makes total sense that there is so much or at least there ought to be much more of these behavioral insights being applied in the space of fundraising and philanthropy. So Tim, it's been great to have you on, and thanks for sharing all of the work that you guys are doing at NextAfter, and I'll be paying close attention to all the stuff that you guys are doing and all the great resources you're putting out there, and I'll be sure to link to everything so listeners can find you and your work. So thanks again, Tim. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.